On the morning of November 14, 1989, a McDonnell Douglas DC-932 operating as Skymark Flight 617 touched down at Miami International Airport at 8:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The arrival was unremarkable. The aircraft taxied to Gate B-12, passengers disembarked, and the crew filed their standard post-flight paperwork. What made this arrival impossible was that according to every piece of documentation filed prior to departure, Flight 617 wasn't scheduled to take off from San Juan, Puerto Rico until 9:15 a.m. that same morning. The flight log showed a landing time 28 minutes before its official departure time. This wasn't a clerical error. It was an entry written by three separate individuals using different forms and different systems, all of which told the same story. Flight 6117 was a routine morning service, one of dozens that move between the Caribbean and the continental United States every day. The route covered approximately 1,041 nautical miles. Standard flight time for a DC-9 on this route, accounting for prevailing winds and normal cruise altitude, was 2 hours and 12 minutes. The aircraft that morning was registered as November 273 Sierra Kilo, a 16-year-old airframe with just over 42,000 flight hours. It had passed its most recent airworthiness inspection 11 days earlier with no discrepancies noted. The crew consisted of Captain Robert Veneman, a former naval aviator with 22 years of commercial experience, First Officer Ann Hollister, who had logged 3,800 hours on type, and 3 cabin crew members. All 5 had reported for duty on time. All 5 had cleared their pre-flight medical and readiness checks. There was nothing in the record to suggest this would be anything other than another sector in a logbook full of identical entries. San Juan's Luis Muñoz Marin International Airport was operating under visual meteorological conditions that morning. Visibility was 10 miles. Winds were light and variable. The DC-9 had been fueled to capacity for a standard routing to Miami, with an alternate filed for Fort Lauderdale. Total fuel load was 14,200 pounds. The aircraft pushed back from Gate 7 at 9:02 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time. It taxied to runway 08 and was cleared for takeoff at 9:14 a.m. First Officer Hollister was the pilot flying. The takeoff roll was normal. Rotation occurred at 133 knots. Gear retraction was confirmed passing 400 feet. The aircraft established contact with San Juan departure and was handed off to San Juan Center 6 minutes later, climbing through flight level 190. At 9:23 a.m., the flight was cleared to flight level 310 and instructed to proceed direct to waypoint Judd's, the first fix on the Miami arrival routing. Captain Veneman acknowledged the clearance. His voice on the recorded transmission was calm and procedural. There was no indication of any abnormality. What happened next exists only in fragments. At 9:31 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time, San Juan Center attempted to confirm the aircraft's altitude as it passed through flight level 270. There was no response. The controller repeated the call. Again, no response. A third attempt was made at 9:33 a.m. The frequency was clear. No other traffic was transmitting. The radar return for Flight 617 remained visible on the controller's scope, still climbing, still on course. But the transponder code had changed. Instead of squawking the assigned code of 2314, the aircraft was now transmitting 1200, the standard VFR code used by aircraft not under positive control. The controller immediately queried the flight, asking them to confirm their assigned squawk code. No reply. At 9:34 a.m., the radar return disappeared entirely, not gradually, not with the slow fade of an aircraft descending below coverage. It vanished in a single sweep. San Juan Center declared a communications emergency and contacted Miami Center to see if the aircraft had prematurely checked in on their frequency. Miami had no contact. A broadcast was made on the emergency frequency 121.5 megahertz. No response. The Coast Guard was notified. Search and rescue protocols were initiated. Controllers began reviewing the last known position. The aircraft had been 63 nautical miles northeast of San Juan, over open water, tracking directly toward the waypoint. There were no other radar targets in the vicinity, no weather cells, no reported turbulence. The sea state in the area was light. If the aircraft had gone down, there should have been an emergency locator transmitter signal. There was none. For 18 minutes, Flight 6117 did not exist on any radar screen, any frequency, or any tracking system between Puerto Rico and Florida. At 9:52 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Miami Approach Control received an unexpected radio call. The voice was Captain Veneman's. He reported Flight 6117 level at flight level 310, 31 miles east of Miami, requesting clearance for the visual approach to runway 9. The controller was silent for nearly 4 seconds. The flight had been listed as missing. Then he asked the captain to confirm his position and souls on board. Veneman repeated the information, his tone slightly confused, and added that they had experienced a brief loss of communication, but that all systems were now normal. Miami Approach issued a clearance and asked the flight to squawk a dent. The transponder return appeared exactly where Veneman had reported. The approach controller noted in his log that the aircraft was precisely on the expected flight path for an arrival from San Juan, and that there was nothing unusual about its speed, altitude, or heading. Flight 617 landed on runway 9 at Miami International at 8:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The touchdown was smooth. The rollout was normal. The aircraft exited at taxiway Kilo and proceeded to the gate without incident. Ground personnel saw nothing unusual. The aircraft showed no external damage. There were no hydraulic leaks, no scorching, no signs of stress or impact. Passengers disembarked. Most barely looked up from their magazines. Several commented later that it had been one of the smoothest flights they'd taken. A gate agent noted the arrival time in the system. That entry read 8:47 a.m. It was the same time printed on the automatic flight log generated by the aircraft's onboard systems. It was the time recorded by ground operations. And it was the time that appeared on every piece of documentation related to the arrival. Captain Veneman and First Officer Hollister completed their shutdown checklist and walked into the operations office to file their post-flight report. Veneman mentioned the communications issue to the duty manager, describing it as a possible transponder fault that had resolved itself in flight. He said they had lost contact with San Juan Center for a short period, but had regained it before switching to Miami's frequency. The duty manager asked if they had declared an emergency. Veneman said no, because the problem had been intermittent and all other systems had remained fully functional. He filled out a maintenance squawk for the transponder and signed the logbook. His watch read 9:03 a.m. He remarked to Hollister that they'd made good time. She agreed. Neither of them had noticed anything wrong with the clock in the cockpit. Neither of them had checked their arrival time against their departure time. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when a dispatcher was reconciling fuel logs, that someone realized the numbers didn't match. The DC-9 had departed San Juan with 14,200 pounds of fuel. Upon arrival in Miami, the aircraft was serviced and refueled. The fueling receipt showed that 11,100 pounds were added. That meant the aircraft had burned 3,100 pounds during the flight. For a DC-9-32 cruising at normal speed and altitude over a distance of 1,041 nautical miles, the expected fuel burn was approximately 6,200 pounds. The aircraft had used half of what it should have. The dispatcher flagged the discrepancy and sent a query to maintenance. Maintenance pulled the flight data recorder's quick access report. The report showed a total flight time of 1 hour and 4 minutes, gate to gate. That was impossible. Even if the aircraft had flown in a perfectly straight line at maximum cruise speed with a direct tailwind of 80 knots, the flight could not have been completed in less than 1 hour and 40 minutes. The quick access report also listed a departure time and an arrival time. The arrival time preceded the departure time by 28 minutes. A formal audit was ordered. Investigators pulled the flight plan, the ATC recordings, the radar data, the fuel receipts, the maintenance logs, the cockpit voice recorder, and the flight data recorder. Every document was examined. The ATC recordings from San Juan confirmed that Flight 6117 had been cleared for takeoff at 9:14 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time. The timestamps on the audio files were checked against the master clock used by the FAA's en route system. They matched. The radar data from San Juan Center showed the aircraft climbing out on course until 9:34 a.m., at which point the target disappeared. The radar data from Miami Approach showed the aircraft appearing at 9:52 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, exactly where it should have been on a normal arrival. Both timestamps were verified. Both were correct. But Miami's logs also showed the landing time as 8:47 a.m. That time appeared on the ATIS report, the tower log, the ground movement log, and the gate assignment system. All of these systems operated independently. None of them had been manually altered. The cockpit voice recorder was reviewed. The tape covered the last 30 minutes of the flight. It began at 8:17 a.m., according to its internal timestamp. That was earlier than the recorded departure time. On the tape, Captain Veneman and First Officer Hollister could be heard running the descent checklist. They discussed the weather in Miami. They acknowledged clearances from Miami Approach. The altimeter settings they read back matched the settings that were active in Miami at that time. At one point, Veneman remarked that they were 2 minutes ahead of schedule. There was no mention of lost time, unusual navigation, or any system malfunction. The final words on the tape were First Officer Hollister confirming that the parking brake was set. The tape ended at 8:47 a.m. The flight data recorder painted an even stranger picture. It recorded every parameter of the flight: airspeed, altitude, heading, engine performance, control inputs, autopilot modes. The data showed a completely normal departure from San Juan. Climb rate was standard. Engine temperatures were normal. Fuel flow was consistent with published performance charts. The aircraft reached flight level 310 and maintained it for the cruise portion of the flight. But the total elapsed time from takeoff to touchdown, as measured by the recorder's internal clock, was 1 hour and 4 minutes. The recorder also logged GPS position data. That data showed the aircraft following the expected flight path with no deviations. It showed the aircraft covering the full distance from San Juan to Miami. The speed over ground averaged 472 knots. That was within normal parameters for a DC-9 at cruise altitude with light winds. But to cover that distance in 1 hour and 4 minutes, the aircraft would have needed to maintain an average ground speed of 977 knots. That would have required winds in excess of 500 knots directly on the tail, or a true airspeed that exceeded the aircraft's maximum structural limit by a factor of 2. Neither was possible. An FAA investigator named Donald Carpenter was assigned to lead the inquiry. He had worked accident investigation for 9 years. He had seen data errors before. He had seen cases where flight recorders had malfunctioned or where timestamps had been corrupted by electrical faults. But those errors were usually obvious. They produced nonsensical values or gaps in the data. This was different. Every piece of recorded data was internally consistent. The fuel burn matched the flight time recorded by the aircraft. The flight time matched the landing time recorded by ground systems. The landing time matched the timestamps on the voice recorder. But none of it matched the departure time, which was verified by multiple independent sources. Carpenter requested access to the GPS satellites that had been in view during the flight. He wanted to verify that the position data was accurate. The GPS logs confirmed that the aircraft had been exactly where the flight data recorder said it was. At the times the recorder said it was there. There was no gap in the satellite data. There was no indication that the GPS receiver had lost lock or experienced any anomaly. Carpenter interviewed the crew. Captain Veneman was cooperative but visibly confused. He insisted that the flight had been completely routine. He had noticed nothing unusual about the departure, the cruise, or the arrival. When asked about the missing 18 minutes, he said he had no memory of any period where they were out of contact with ATC for more than a few seconds. First Officer Hollister gave a nearly identical account. She described the flight as unremarkable in every way. She said the autopilot had been engaged for the majority of the cruise and that she had monitored the flight management system continuously. She remembered checking their estimated time of arrival shortly after leveling off at cruise altitude. The FMS had predicted an arrival time of 11:26 a.m. Eastern, which would have been correct for a 2-hour flight. But she also remembered looking at the clock on the instrument panel when they landed, and it had read 8:47 a.m. When Carpenter asked her how she reconciled those two facts, she said she couldn't. She said she had assumed there was an error somewhere in the logs because her own experience of the flight did not include any missing time or any period where they had jumped forward. The passengers were harder to track. Most had continued on connecting flights or left the airport before the discrepancy was noticed. 8 passengers were eventually interviewed. None reported anything unusual. One passenger, a software engineer from Orlando, had been wearing a digital watch that automatically synced to atomic time signals. He checked the photo metadata on pictures he had taken during the flight. The timestamps on those photos aligned with the departure and arrival times recorded by ground systems in Miami. According to his watch and his camera, the flight had lasted 1 hour and 4 minutes. Another passenger, a retired airline captain who had been sitting in first class, said he had noticed that the flight seemed unusually short. He had expected it to take longer, but he attributed that to favorable winds and didn't think much of it at the time. Carpenter expanded the investigation to include meteorological data. He obtained wind reports from the National Weather Service for the entire flight path. On the morning of November 14th, winds at flight level 310 over the Caribbean were light and variable, averaging 15 knots from the east. There had been no jet stream activity in the area. There had been no frontal systems, no convective weather, and no significant turbulence reported by any aircraft. He also reviewed data from other flights operating in the same airspace at the same time. 4 other aircraft had been within 50 miles of Flight 617's route during the period in question. None of them reported anything unusual. None of them experienced any navigational anomalies or communication failures. Their flight times were all consistent with normal performance and expected fuel burns. One detail stood out in the radar data. At 9:34 a.m., when Flight 617's transponder return disappeared from San Juan Center's screen, there had been a momentary anomaly in the radar system itself. For approximately 2 seconds, the entire display had flickered. 3 other targets in the same sector had also disappeared briefly before reappearing in their expected positions. The technician on duty had noted the event in his log and reported it as a possible software glitch. The radar system had been checked and found to be operating normally. No fault codes were recorded. The anomaly was attributed to a routine processing error and was not investigated further. Carpenter requested the raw radar data from that time period. The data showed that during those 2 seconds, the radar had stopped recording position information for all targets in a specific volume of airspace. That volume was approximately 40 nautical miles wide and extended from flight level 250 to flight level 350. Flight 6117 had been at the center of that volume. Carpenter also reviewed the air traffic control recordings in detail. At 9:31 a.m., the San Juan Center controller had called Flight 6117 to confirm their altitude. The call was clear and audible on the tape. There was no response. At 9:33 a.m., the controller made a second call. Still no response. At 9:34 a.m., just before the radar target vanished, the controller made a third call. In the background of that transmission, faintly audible beneath the controller's voice, there was a brief burst of static. It lasted less than a second. Audio analysis of the tape revealed that the static had a frequency signature inconsistent with normal radio interference. It was a narrow-band pulse centered at 121.55 MHz, slightly offset from the emergency frequency. That frequency is not used by any standard aviation system. It is not assigned to any commercial or military user. When Carpenter asked FAA engineers what could generate such a signal, they had no explanation. The cockpit voice recorder also contained an anomaly. At 8:17 a.m., when the tape began, there was a brief section of audio that didn't match the rest of the recording. For approximately 3 seconds before Captain Veneman began speaking, there was a low-frequency hum. The hum was rhythmic, pulsing at a rate of approximately 7 cycles per second. It was present on all 4 channels of the recorder, which meant it had been picked up by microphones throughout the cockpit. The sound was not consistent with any aircraft system. It was not an engine tone, a hydraulic pump, or an air conditioning noise. A technician who specialized in acoustic analysis described it as resembling a magnetic field oscillation, the kind produced by large electrical transformers. But there were no transformers on the aircraft capable of producing such a sound, and the hum stopped abruptly when the captain began speaking. It did not appear anywhere else on the tape. 3 months after the flight, the FAA issued its preliminary findings. The report acknowledged the discrepancies in the recorded times, but concluded that they were most likely the result of a cascading instrumentation error. The report suggested that the aircraft's flight management system had experienced a temporary fault that caused it to output incorrect timestamps to the flight data recorder. That fault, combined with a coincidental error in the Miami ground systems, had created the appearance of a temporal inconsistency. The report noted that the crew had reported no abnormalities and that the aircraft had operated safely throughout the flight. It recommended additional maintenance checks on the FMS and a review of timestamp synchronization procedures across the system. The report did not explain the fuel burn discrepancy. It did not explain the radar anomaly. It did not explain the audio artifacts on the cockpit voice recorder. Those items were listed as unresolved and were classified as low priority for further investigation. Captain Veneman retired 6 months later. In a brief interview conducted shortly before his retirement, he was asked about Flight 6117. He said he had thought about it often. He said the hardest part was not the investigation or the scrutiny, but the fact that he could not reconcile his own memory with the data. He remembered the flight as taking roughly 2 hours. He remembered checking the time at several points during the cruise and seeing that they were on schedule. But he also remembered landing and seeing the clock read 8:47 a.m. When asked if he thought the instruments had malfunctioned, he said he didn't know. He said instruments can fail, but they usually fail in ways that are obvious. This hadn't been obvious. It had been invisible. First Officer Hollister left commercial aviation 2 years later. She declined to be interviewed. The aircraft itself, November 273 Sierra Kilo, remained in service for another 4 years. It flew thousands of sectors without incident. Maintenance logs from that period show no recurring faults related to the flight management system, the transponders, or any other avionics. In 1993, the aircraft was sold to a regional carrier in South America. It was retired in 1998 and scrapped. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder from Flight 6117 were retained by the FAA and are still stored in a facility in Oklahoma City. They have not been examined since 1990. There are two ways to interpret what happened on November 14, 1989. The first is that every clock, every recorder, every radar system, and every ground-based timestamp in Miami was wrong, and that the flight actually arrived at the time the departure records suggest it should have. The second is that the clocks and recorders were correct, and the flight arrived 28 minutes before it departed. Neither explanation fits. If the Miami systems were wrong, they were all wrong in exactly the same way, by exactly the same amount, with no detectable cause. If the systems were correct, then the aircraft traveled backward through a segment of time that no other instrument, no other aircraft, and no other observer experienced. The fuel burn supports the short flight time. The crew's memory supports the long flight time. The radar data supports both and neither. Donald Carpenter, the investigator who led the inquiry, was asked years later if he had formed a personal opinion about what had occurred. He said he had learned not to trust single points of failure. He said in aviation, when something appears impossible, it usually means you're missing information. But he also said that in this case, he wasn't sure what information could be missing. Every instrument that could have recorded the flight had recorded it. Every piece of data that could have been checked had been checked. He said the flight had been observed, measured, and documented more thoroughly than almost any routine flight in history, and it still didn't make sense. When asked if he thought the case would ever be resolved, he said no. He said the evidence was complete, and that was the problem. There was nothing left to find. Flight 617 still appears in the FAA's incident database. The entry is brief. It lists the date, the flight number, the aircraft registration, and a single sentence. Temporal discrepancy in recorded arrival time. Cause undetermined. There are no follow-up entries. The case was never officially closed, but no further investigation was conducted. The file remains open, though no one has accessed it in over a decade. The crew is no longer alive to be asked. The passengers have moved on. The aircraft no longer exists. What remains is a set of records that say two different things, both of which are verified, neither of which can be true. If you follow aviation mysteries and unexplained incidents, subscribe for future investigations.